I begin with the name of Allah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We seek refuge in the bounty, in the mercy, and the blessings of Allah from the shaitan and the words of the shaitan. And one of the biggest words of the shaitan is lying. Because the shaitan is a liar and a deceiver. He seeks to misguide men and women, boys and girls and children away from the straight path. A straight path that leads you through this life into eternity. All right? He seeks to misguide you, to cause doubts inside the heart, to make wandering, misguided paths seem like the right path, and the right path look like an evil path. He makes good look like evil, and evil look like good. So you have to be aware. You have to be crafty, because he's crafty. He's extremely crafty. So you have to be crafty. You have to know what's going on. And you have to be quick-witted to understand what's happening. Today's show is entitled Myth-Busting Afrocentric Views on the History of Islam in Africa. I've been working up to the point of doing this show because I've been researching, reading, and looking into the subject. One of the books that I've been consuming since I got this maybe a week ago, and I have wanted to get this book for a while, and I finally got my hands on it, is this work right here. Afrocentrism, a Black Muslim Critique, by the brothers at Black Dawah Network. This is written by Shareef Muhammad, Professor Shareef Muhammad. This is an incredible book, an excellent work. If you want to know more about this particular subject that I'm going to talk about in this show, I highly recommend this book and others, which we will show to you, inshallah, if the creator of the heavens and the earth, the Most High, allows it to happen. All right. Now, you should see a meme up on the screen at the moment. This is a meme that someone created. So this is how the haters of Muslims and the haters of Islam, they attack al-Islam and the Muslim people. Many people are familiar with the term Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a term coined by a French scholar in the early 1900s. He was commissioned by the French government to investigate discrimination that was taking place in colonial France in North Africa, like Algeria, Libya, places like this that were being occupied by the French. And he wrote a work, and he coined this phrase as Islamophobia to describe the way the French soldiers and the French colonial powers looked at, perceived, and treated these African Muslims. He coined it as Islamophobia. Now, a phobia is an irrational fear, non-rational, unrational fear. It's an unrational fear of al-Islam. Now, when you hear the term Islamophobia, you tend to think of, let's be honest here, race is going to be discussed in this podcast. So if you're the type of person you don't like, I don't want to hear that race stuff, you need to leave right now. But if you want to deal with reality and facts, then you need to stay. So when you hear Islamophobia, what usually pops up in people's minds is a far-right, conservative, Republican, fundamentalist, white Christian who dislikes Arabs, who dislikes South Asians, who is suspicious at best of Muslim intentions. They don't like the fact that Muslims are immigrating into America. They tend to believe in absurd conspiracy theories, like, Muslim immigrants are coming into America to infiltrate the government, to take over and establish an Islamic state, an Islamic caliphate in the West. That Muslim civil rights organizations are secret jihadist groups, and they're plotting jihad against England and against Sweden and against Canada and America, right? That's what you usually think about when you hear the term Islamophobia. But Islamophobia is a disease, mainly from an Islamic standpoint, and we deal with the metaphysical before we deal with the physical. For a metaphysical standpoint, it's a disease of the heart. Just like jealousy, envy, hatred, all these things play into Islamophobia. So it's a disease of the heart. And it's an illness of the mind not functioning correctly, the mind being ignorant, and out of its ignorance, it forms an ignorant opinion, and it believes the ignorant opinion is reality. But if the mind was educated, if the mind had accurate information, if the mind could reason, put forth 1 + 1 = 2 correctly, logic, then it wouldn't be burdened with such a disease as Islamophobia. So Islamophobia is not just the disease of a person who is Republican, conservative, white, Anglo-Saxon, Christian. Islamophobia can affect people outside of that. And when you have as a anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic Western media complex, that for years, there's a book and a documentary called Real Bad Arabs, real as in REEL, like a movie reel. And the focus is on Arabs, but it obviously touches on Muslims as well. And I did a video, if you want to check out that, the word that the word that Arab designates a language and culture is not synonymous with Islam. Every Arab is not a Muslim. Every Muslim is not an Arab. But see, that's an example of the ignorant mind. The ignorant mind would think these two things are synonymous. But back to my point. With the anti-Muslim, Islamophobic media complex, where we've had decades upon decades of film, movies, television, video games, depicting Muslims and people of the Middle East as being evil, terrorists, bad guys. Anytime you look at you just go on Netflix and look at your action movies. How many action movies can you count where the antagonists, the bad guys, are Muslim or situated in the Muslim world, right? They're wearing Muslim garb or garb that is associated with Muslims. They're screaming, Allahu Akbar, right? You see this very often. And if you're like me, I was born and raised in America. If you have been born and raised in America and you've consumed media your whole entire life, you have been flooded with this anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic propaganda. And I'm black, right? So black people are not immune from being Islamophobic. In fact, the whole point of the show is to deal with a subsection of Islamophobia that is wrapped in kente cloth. Islamophobia that is supposedly meant to empower black people. But a phobia cannot empower black people, because phobia is an irrational fear, irrational emotions concerning Islam. So irrationality cannot empower black people or Africans or the African continent or the African diaspora. It can't. We don't need that. But we do need accurate information and the truth. And concerning this information, I like to touch on it a little bit and give forth a little bit of information in hopes, inshallah, if God wills, that it helps somebody. All right. Now, in this book, chapter number 6 is entitled The Inaccuracies of Ben Johanan. I always have trouble saying our brother Ben's last name. And Dr. Ben, for those who don't know, you can look this up. Dr. Ben converted to al-Islam before he died. He died as a Muslim. Muslim brothers in Harlem who knew him personally before his demise recount that he took his shahada, he attended Jumu'ah, and he would come pray in the masjid, and brothers from the mosque would come and visit him. So regardless of all the things Dr. Ben may have said negatively about Muslims and Islam, whether they were accurate or inaccurate, and many things he said were inaccurate, he, of his own free will, nobody put a sword to his neck, he took the Shahada and became Muslim. So when Dr. Ben was facing death, and he knew the end of his days were coming, he needed to do something about his metaphysical self, his soul. You can't just be completely focused on the material all the time. But see, that's the narrative of certain grifters on social media. You know, some people call them hoteps. They would have people to think material success constitutes the total and full breadth of Black achievement, Black excellence, and Black advancement beyond the condition that Black people find themselves in today. That if only Black people can be comparable and equal in material wealth to whites, then we have achieved something tangible. Yes, that would be something. Material is tangible, but that is not an African way of thinking. That is a Eurocentric way of thinking. Let me repeat that. Like Dr. Umar, when he repeats things 3 times, to get inside y'all thick skulls. Do I gotta repeat it 3 times? I guess so. Mere material wealth and advancement, and a hyper focus on it at the exclusion of the metaphysical, at the exclusion of what isn't materially tangible, the spiritual things in life, is not African. That is not an African way of thinking. You won't find any indigenous African peoples, tribes, cultures, ethnicities, spirituality, spiritual systems, religions, empires, none of them from the past up to the present, none of them think in that fashion. But the African mind within the last 100 years has been infected and trounced upon by European ideologies such as communism, Marxism, Western liberalism. And like I said about Islamophobia being dressed up in kente cloth, also communism, Marxism has been dressed up in kente cloth. So that Eurocentric ideology that was so adamant against religion and blamed the problems of the human race and the world on religion. And we saw with the USSR, a communist state, that they banned and outlawed religion among their population, that they propagated propaganda to their population that was anti-religious, right? We see that same notion among some African people, whether they're African people in the continent or African people in the Caribbean, South America, or the Americas, North America. And it's garbed in kente cloth. It's garbed with a sphinx and a ankh. So you would think when it's presented to you, oh, this is African thinking. This is African spirituality. This is, we're getting into our African era. But no, it's just Marxism. It's just Karl Marx's ideas with a black person expounding them. So yeah, so the communists and the Mason hate religion and always have hate religion, and they've been at war with all the religions, including al-Islam. That is the true root of this anti-Islamic sentiment among some Afrocentrists and some members of the so-called Black consciousness community. So he has a chapter in his book, as I was stating, The Inaccuracies of Ben Johanan and Chancellor Williams on the Spread of Islam in America. And Chancellor Williams wrote a book entitled The Destruction of Black Civilization. Very influential book. It basically, you can say it kicked off this whole anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim sentiment within Afrocentric thought. He's the first one. He's the innovator of that. But there's a lot of things you need to understand about Chancellor Williams, a lot of things you need to understand about his book. And for some people, this may seem blasphemous, because one of the problems with Afrocentric thought is there has been a cementing of ideas, a orthodoxy that has come about. And when the problem with any ideology is when you have a orthodoxy and people cling to the orthodoxy in almost a cultish manner. You cling to personalities in a cultish manner where you start blind following them, and you're not capable of being critical of the things they say and the ideas that they present. Then you start accepting what they say as the gospel truth. And you even go further than that. You want to evangelize other people with the ideology and ideas of your scholar, your speaker. The scholar and speaker become almost like a pope or a bishop or a pastor even. So even though some Afrocentrists and conscious community people, they criticize the Christian, right? They say, oh, these black Christians, they're following the pastor, and these black people in the Catholic Church, they're blind following the Pope. But many of them do the same exact thing, where they accept anything that's given to them in the name of black consciousness or Afrocentricity as absolute gospel truth without any critical examination, analyzation, without the need to ask for proof. See, this is the one thing that separates Islam from other so-called spiritualities, paths, and religions. Nothing can be established in Al-Islam without proof, right? You can't establish something to be Islamic. See, people toss that word around. Is this Islamic? The Islamic State Caliphate in Iraq, Islamic terrorism, Islamic jihadism, these Islamics did this, the Islamic invasion of Africa. They use this word a lot, but you can't, it doesn't work like that in Islam. You can't say something is Islamic without proof. It's not based on opinions and feelings. So, because there's been an orthodoxy that is set in with men like Dr. Ben and Chancellor Williams and others, that they become almost like popes, where the people take from them and take from their books, and they're non-critical of what they say. So if you disagree with them, you're crazy. If you disagree with them, you're ignorant. If you disagree with them, you must hate being black. You don't like yourself. You're a safe here. To be black, to be truly African, you're not really pro-black unless you blind follow these people. And not to say that Dr. Ben, Chancellor Williams, and others, Sheikh Antideo, all these people, they made great books. They made great points. They made contributions to uplifting black people and unveiling black history. And true black history needed to be unveiled because of the white power structure and global white supremacy had made us think that Africa was the dark continent full of naked people and bush people with bones in their noses who didn't know how to do math, who could barely talk, and they didn't have language, they didn't have the will. They were primitive idol worshipers. That's the idea that they gave to the world. As far as black people, Africans and the Americans, they made us think that we're just slaves. The sum total of our person and our being and our history is slavery. We were slaves we got transported to America. We were slaves. There was no history beyond that. And what these men did, which was an excellent thing that they did, is they exposed that black people had a history before coming in contact with Europeans. Black people had history before the transatlantic slave trade, before we were on plantations in North and South Carolina and Mississippi and Georgia and all these other places. Before all that, before the Civil War, we had a history that had nothing to do with white people. We had our own empires, we had our own languages, we had our own scripts, we had our own civilizations. Everybody in Africa was not a bush person. There were empires, there were metropolitan areas and cities of high learning. There were universities, the first universities in the history of the world were in Africa. There were scholars, there were books, there were mathematicians, astronomers, theologians in Africa. And it wasn't just in Africa. That knowledge came out of Africa to the rest of the world. Look at Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. It originated and came up out of Africa over into Spain, into Europe. And Muslims who originated in Africa, they came into Spain as well. They came into Italy. They came into southern France. They went all the way up into the Netherlands, establishing Islamic governments and rule. And it benefited and advanced the European continent and allowed the European continent to come out of the dark ages. This is actual facts of history. But this was hidden from us. And it was hidden from many of you. It was hidden from the world. And we have to give these men and other men like them, the Afrocentrists, we have to give them credit for breaking down that barrier, for that knowledge to come out and be known and to be able to be studied by us. And as grateful as we are to them because of this, we still have to be academic. We still have to be scholarly in our research. Because the moment when you start using words like scholar, research, academia, then you have to be subject to the rigors and the level of scrutiny that academics are subject to, right? When you're an academic, you create peer-reviewed papers. You have a theory, you have to create a paper, and you have to submit it so it can be peer-reviewed by other scholars, by your peers. And these other scholars are going to critique. They're going to criticize. They're going to try to poke holes in. They're going to find inaccuracies and inconsistencies in your theory. That's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Because it allows you to go to either do one or two things. It either allows you to make your theory better by removing these inaccuracies and inconsistencies and doing more research and updating your your thesis, or it may be that you need to scrap the whole entire thesis altogether. If there's so many inaccuracies and mistakes, then it has to be scrapped. And emotion and attachment can't stop you from changing your mind about these things. So again, the Afrocentrists did a lot of good, but it has to be said with truthfulness and honesty that many of the things they have said about the history of Islam and Africa are inaccurate. And that has to be repaired. That has to be repaired. Now, let me read the first paragraph of our brother Shareef Muhammad's book in this chapter. He says, I can still see the cover art of The Destruction of Black Civilization. In fact, right there. That's the book right there. That's the book right there. You can see right here. This is the cover art he's referring to. Page 75. I don't want to lose this page 75, but I want to show you the cover art he's talking about. He's going to be talking about. Right here. See this cover art? See that cover art? The Destruction of Black Civilization. This is a monumental work, right? Monumental work, but, yeah, it's a monumental work, but is it above scrutiny? Is everything in this book accurate? Is everything in this book true? And look at the back of the book. You have different quotes of different people who read the book. And one of them is from the magazine Muhammad Speaks, which was from the Nation of Islam. Isn't that telling? That the book has inaccurate depictions of Islam and Islamic history in Africa, and yet it was praised by the Muhammad Speaks magazine. Okay? But listen to what he says. I can still see the cover art of The Destruction of Black Civilization protruding in my mind. Right? The destruction of, if it features what looks to be a pale-skinned invader on a horseback, wearing mail with his sword in hand, about to fight what appears to be an African holding a singe and a nguni shield while wearing a loincloth. It is the most ridiculous image historically, seeing as no Arabs or medieval Europeans ever invaded South Africa and fought the Xhosa tribe. But the cover with its glaring historical inaccuracy perfectly sums up Afrocentric fiction. I wish I had a clue bomb right now. I wish I had a clue. Boom. A clue bomb should go off right now. And a lot of what is presented to the public in the name of being Afrocentric is just that. It is fiction. And it's very unfortunate because the men who put this Afrocentric gene together, like who people say is the father of this field, Sheikh Anta was a true scholar, but somehow in the process it deviated from rigorous scholarship, and it went into something, and today is into something completely else. It went from Afrocentric to Black consciousness to what some people term as Hotep. And Hotep is a clown show on social media. It's grifters like Brother Polite and Dr. Umar Johnson and Red Pill, Blue Pill, and these other people who they say many good things. They say things that are good, and they say things that are true, but mixed in with it is a whole lot of non-scholarly, non-academic fiction and conspiracy And it's almost like, it's like the black hat. It's like if you had a coin, you have two faces of a coin. It's like the black side of what you see over in the far right with the Trump supporters and the alt-right and all their conspiracy theories like QAnon and all this other stuff. Except this is the black side of that whole thing, where people invent all types of conspiracy, invent stories, invent theories in the name of uplifting black people. But how can you uplift black people with irrationalities, with inaccuracies, and with bold-faced lies? That does not ultimately lift black people up. And maybe that's why, despite 50 years, 60 years of this movement, it has not lifted black people in America out of the conditions that they're in. Because we were told by them that if black people simply learn their true history, that will elevate us and it will be the salvation of us against white supremacy. And it hasn't done that yet. Maybe the reason it hasn't done that yet is because of the inaccuracies and lies that have been mixed in with the truth and presented to the people. He goes on to say, this fiction is at the core of how Islam and Muslims are discussed in Afrocentric circles. This chapter sets the record straight about the actual role of Islam in Africa, how it spread and its impact on indigeneity. Sorry about that. The irony of this controversy is that of all the places Islam spread, sub-Saharan Africa was the region that did not involve force. There were no Arab military campaigns responsible for its Islamic kingdoms. Islam in Africa was an indigenous process. By this, I mean that the conversion to the faith and its implementation were the decision of Africans. That's an extremely important point. In fact, I highlighted it. It was so important. Because Afrocentrics, as we're going to see, have taken much of their attitude and their claims about the Islamic African history from whites, from Orientalists, especially Chancellor Williams. We're going to see where Chancellor Williams was educated and where he got his concepts and his ideas about Islam. And it's purely Eurocentric, even though he is supposedly fighting against Eurocentric, because the whole point of Afrocentric thought is to oppose Eurocentric thought. But you're taking Eurocentric scholars on face value about what they had to say about Islam and the history of Islam in Africa. That's a conundrum. That's a contradiction. So, in reality, Islam in sub-Saharan Africa was voluntary. People embraced Islam because they wanted to embrace Islam, like myself, an African American, and many other African Americans. African Americans make up the bulk of those who have converted to Al-Islam in the United States. The second best group are Latinos, and we know that Latinos have African ancestry to a certain extent, depending on what part of the world they're from. So people of African descent, the African diaspora, have been the main people to embrace Islam in the Americas. Did someone put a sword to our neck and tell us, be Muslim or die? Say the Shahada or we'll chop your head off? No, nobody forced Islam on us. We embraced Islam because when we learned about Islam, we were impressed with Islam and Iman, which some people refer to as faith, but that's not an accurate translation, because Iman is more than faith. It's the confession of the lips, it's the belief in the heart, it's the action of the limbs. It entered into our heart and we became Muslim. The same thing happened on the African continent. If you look at the the biography of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the seerah, which there are many seerahs, like the sealed nectar, that illustrate and talk about the earliest times of Islam during the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Arabia. If you look at this, you will see their migration plays heavily in the story of early Islam. Prophet Muhammad and his followers in the city of Mecca migrated to the city of Yathrib, which became the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet, right? But before that great migration to Yathrib, there was another migration. There was another migration that many non-Muslims don't know about, or they don't talk about. And Muslims themselves don't talk about enough. That was the migration to Ethiopia, to Abyssinia. There was so much persecution from the polytheist pagan Arabs against Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, sent a delegation of Muslims to the king of Ethiopia at that time, right? And the Muslims found a place of refuge in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, right? That was the origin of Islam coming into Africa. Muslims migrating to the kingdom of Ethiopia as guests, as welcome guests, and the court of the Ethiopian king embraced them, and some of them embraced Islam. Really, no swords, no Arab hordes, none of that. In fact, there's another book I have on the. I have several books on Islam in Africa. I have several books. One by Shaykh Muhammad Al-Iman Al-Jami, Shaykh Muhammad Al-Jami, Al-Ethiopi. May Allah have mercy upon him. I've taken quotes from that book and placed it on my community page. I have another books, right? Like this book right here. Great book. The History of Islam in Africa. It's a very thick book. I haven't finished it yet, but there's so much history about this, you know, because of Al-Islam benefited the African, and the African took Islam and made it his own. It was not simply Arabized as the Afrocentric and the right-wing Islamophobe would like people to believe. And isn't it so funny that the Islamophobic Afrocentric and the Islamophobic white evangelical agree with each other? You don't find that suspicious? You don't find that odd? I find that quite odd. So let's look elsewhere. Let me read some more. You know what? Before I go to some other material, let me read some more quotes from this book. This is Muhammad Shareef's book. Another highlight. He talks about the main impact of Islam in Africa was urbanization. So Islam came into Africa and it entered the Islamic kingdom. It entered African kingdoms and it spurred urbanization, the building of cities and the spreading out of cities, and Africans going from the agrarian countryside life into a more urban, sophisticated city life. Right? It was enthusiastically adopted. I'm reading from the book. It was enthusiastically adapted by African nobles to consolidate their realms, improve their economic structure, and expand their trade networks. This was the main impact of Islam on Black Africa. It accelerated urbanization. We're talking about how Islam came to Africa and how it spread throughout the continent. It must be noted that the process was not the same in every area. That's another thing. You can't, part of being scholarly inaccurate from the Afrocentrics is to make broad brush comments to make generalizations. Islam came into different parts of the African continent, and we get that Africa is not a country, Africa is a continent. When Islam came into different parts of the continent, it came in different ways. It was accepted in different ways. It had a different impact. You can't speak in broad terms. It's not accurate. Here's another highlighted. It was not the policy or the practice anywhere, and Islam did not completely eradicate the traditional beliefs of the region as evident by their presence today. Let me read the whole quote. The motives and methods were different in each case, but what they had in common is their compulsory conversion never occurred. Compulsory conversion never occurred. It was not the policy or the practice anywhere, and Islam did not completely eradicate the traditional beliefs. So there's a lot of talk about traditional African spirituality, indigenous African spirituality. Well, no one ever takes the time to ask themselves if there was this horde of Arabs and Arab armies that came into sub-Saharan Africa, and they destroyed African kingdoms, as Chancellor Williams claims in his book. Why did indigenous African religions still exist? Riddle me that, Batman. So even though you had Islamic kingdoms like Ghana and Mali and Songhai, where the rulers and the people in the city were Muslim. So Islam spread amongst the people in the city, and as the Africans became more urbanized, more of them converted to Islam. But out in the countryside, many of the Africans remain in a tribal society, and they still practice their indigenous tribal religions. And the reason why those indigenous tribal religions still exist to this day is because they were not eradicated by the Muslims. Why did there was no eradication of these tribal religions, these so-called traditional African spiritualities? Those people were not forced into Islam. They were not prohibited from practicing their religion. That's why the religion still exists. That's why even in majority Muslim countries today in Africa, you can still find tribes of people out in the countryside who still live their traditional tribal way of life along with their religion and spirituality. Right? So that in itself refutes the narrative that somehow Islam came in by being spread by the sword into Africa and people were forced into Islam. That's a contradiction when we look at the historical record. How do Afrocentrics account for that? They don't. I've listened to hundreds of shows by numerous Afrocentrics, Black consciousness channels, and straight up hoteps. And they never bring that subject up. They never touch on it. They never think about it. And their audience doesn't even think about it, which shows you how much many of the audience is just blind following whatever they're told and whatever they hear, because you're not employing critical thinking. Because a person who has critical thinking would ask questions like that. This is another quote. The only area where Islam was initially entered by military force is North Africa. The Muslim invasion of Egypt was an extension of the Ridda War, launched by the first successor of Muhammad, peace be upon him, Abu Bakr, may Allah have mercy on him. He took action against the Arab tribes in the north of Najd, who apostated by refusing to pay the zakat, the purity tax incumbent on every Muslim. There was intelligence that said these northern tribes were being instigated by Rome or Persia. Stop. To give you some historical background, Rome or Byzantine and Persia were the two superpowers in the world at that time. Right? These were the two superpowers. So Islam began in Arabia, then immediately went into the African continent via Ethiopia into East Africa. The Muslims were a small nation, and they were in between two superpowers, one Byzantine or Rome and the other Persia, right? And they had already at the end of Prophet Muhammad's life, peace be upon him, been some incursions, not real battles, incursions with the Romans. And Prophet Muhammad, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't read it word for word, but Prophet Muhammad actually gave a prophecy that did come true, that the Muslims would fight the Romans and defeat them. That's what happened. That was the fulfillment of that prophet is a part of what happened in Egypt and North Africa. All right, let's continue to read. The two superpowers at that time, Roman and Persian. So the Muslim army, the Muslim arm that was sent into the north so the Muslim army that was sent into the north to subdue the recalcitrant tribes and force them back into the fold of the new caliphate moved into North Africa by way of the Egypt and Persia. Before we go any further, we must disavow ourselves of the false idea of Black North Africa in the 7th century. So hold on. Let's break that down a little bit. So the Muslim arm that was sent to the north, that's North Arabia. So from Medina, where the caliphate was, soldiers are sent to the north of Arabia because you have certain people there who are aligning themselves with the Romans and the Persians, and they're refusing to pay tax to the caliphate, right? To deal with the recalcitrant tribes and force them back into the fold of the new caliphate moved into. So they're pursuing them and they're fighting them. The fight moves across the so-called Middle East because the term Middle East wasn't used at this time. The term Middle East is actually a relatively new term. In fact, some people would consider Arabia a part of Northeast Africa. There are books and documentaries on that, but we're not going to get into that right now. So the fight goes into what we call the Middle East and crosses over into North Africa, into Egypt. He says in the book, before we go any further, we must disabuse ourselves of the false idea of a Black North Africa in the 7th century. North Africa was not black in the 7th century. I'm sorry. People who believe in Kemetics, who believe ancient Kim or Egypt was a black civilization. They believe that Mayat is a black religion, the Egyptian mystery schools. They paint up the Afrocentric and the Black consciousness community would paint a picture to people who are not that well read that all of Egypt was black at all times and spaces until these Arabs came. And that's how the people you see there in Egypt, that's how they became light-skinned and white. So it was black, then these Arabs came and invaded. That is historically inaccurate. It's fiction. It's fiction. He goes on to say, we know from all the available sources that the ethnic and racial identity of North Africa was compromised long before the Arabs. The common mistake of Afrocentrists is that they attribute practices to the Arabs that had been carrying on long before the rise of Islam. Let me read that again. The common mistake of Afrocentrists is that they attribute practices to the Arabs that had been carrying on long before the rise of Islam. We're going to see that as we go. Like, what do they blame on the Arabs entering Africa? Slavery, as if Arabs brought slavery into Africa. Arabs did not bring slavery into Africa. Slavery was already being practiced. The ancient Kemites practiced slavery. The ancient Kemites practiced expansionist wars. The ancient Kemites conquered other people's land. The ancient Kemites raided people's villages in cities, and they took people prisoner and put them into slavery and worked them. Right? The Nubians did the same thing. The Ethiopians did the same thing. But the inaccurate narrative of the Afrocentrists, the Black consciousness community, and even the Hotep would make you believe that, you know, Africa was a never land that had no violence, no tyrants, no slavery. Africa was just this big, it wasn't even a continent. It's like a nation of Wakanda. And it wasn't until these Arabs came and messed everything up. And then after the Arabs came, the Europeans came and they messed everything up. That's historically inaccurate. It's a fairy tale designed to make Black people feel good. And Black people, that's not what we need. We need to be adults. We need to be mature. We need to be strong. We don't need fairy tales given to us in the name of and wrapped in the cloth of scholarship that we think is scholarship. That only embarrasses us when we go before the other nations and the other groups and the other ethnicities and make these claims, and they know it's historically inaccurate. They know it's hogwash. It makes us appear, it enforces the negative stereotypes about us, about the lack of rigor and intelligence of the African. So we can't allow people to get away with this. It's very critical we don't allow people to get away with this. All right, continuing to read from the brother. But I digress. The North African of history is not the North Africa. The North Africa of history is not the North Africa of the Afrocentric imagination. Prior to the Randall Wars, North Africans had been increasingly miscegenated, starting as far back as the Ice Age. Miscegenated means mixture of different cultures. Mixture of different, hold one second. Sorry about that break. Like I was saying, miscegenated, mixture of different cultures, mixture of different ethnicities and people groups, right? This had gone on since the Ice Age. Before Arabs, the Afrocentric revisionist history says all the African continent was Black, including North Africa. And then these white Arabs, as Chancellor Williams likes to call them, white Arabs, and that's another inaccuracy of Afrocentrists, is that Arabs are white. Arabs are diversified in far as color, in ancient times and in today. That these quote-unquote white Arabs came in and then they mixed with the Africans, and that's how you got all these light-skinned people in North Africa today. That's inaccurate. You can look this up and verify it for yourself. Now, I ask you to do that. I'm not your pope or your master teacher. Verify everything I have to say. Scrutinize it. Scrutinize me, and then scrutinize the Afrocentrists as well, and the Hotep. But be fair and use the same criteria. That's all I ask. So miscegenation had been happening since the Ice Age. Beginning from Egypt, the further west you travel, the lighter in complexion the people were. This is because the recessive migrations of Europeans into Northwest Africa dating around 2000 BCE, and possibly the Ice Age where Europeans moved into Morocco and Mauritania. Then there were the centuries of Carthaginians, Greek, Roman, and Vandal settlements which dramatically affected the look of the population. First, there were the Phoenicians, Canaanites, Carthaginians. Then came Europe, then came Rome, which ruled North Africa in 146 BCE and maintained power until 430 BCE. Then came the Vandals, who were a Germanic tribe. They remained in power until 530 BACE. When the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, reconquered North Africa. They held power for 10 years until they lost control to the Persians. And then the Byzantines regained control, dominating until 640 ACE, when the Muslims invaded and took control. So this Afrocentric fantasy of Black people having a Wakanda in North Africa, and then these white Arabs coming and invading and destroying their civilization and mixing with them, and that's how you get these light-skinned people in North Africa, is pure fiction. It's not historically accurate. There have been light-skinned, white-skinned people in North Africa going all the way back to the BC era, before Christ, going back to the Ice Age. Europeans have been coming into North Africa for millennia upon millennia, mixing with the indigenous population and changing the color of the people. All right? Quoting from the brother on the page 92, when the Muslims first arrived in Egypt in 640 ACE, there were no pharaohs or mystery schools. The native religion was Coptic Christianity, which was harshly repressed by the Byzantine Roman Church. These native Copts certainly did not identify with being African, at least not racially. When the envoy of Amr ibn Samet, the Arab general who led the Muslim army into Egypt, first met with the Coptic archbishop to discuss the terms of their surrender, the archbishop said to the Arabs, "Take this Black man away from me. I can have no dealings with him." Man, I need a clue bomb so bad right now. So this turns the Afrocentric Black consciousness Hotep narrative completely around. The native population in Egypt were white, or at least if you don't want to call them white, if you don't want to use a designation or terminology that is modern, they were not sub-Saharan African. To the point where when the Muslim general came to have a discussion with the leader of the Copts, which destroys the whole spread by the sword narrative, that the reaction of the North African to the Arab general was, "I don't talk to Black folks." So he saw him as Black. Ain't that something? Ain't that something? Ain't that something? The other Arabs replied that most of them looked like their leader, whom he rejected. The story is recounted in Alfred J. Butler's Arab Invasion of Egypt, last 13 years of Roman domination. So that's that. That's enough of that. Do I need to? I mean, I'm not going to sit here and read the whole entire book. I suggest if you want to know more, you go get the book. But what I just read destroys the whole entire narrative. Does it not? It destroys the whole entire narrative. Okay. So this whole idea of the white Arabs coming into Africa is fiction, because you had Arabs that were so dark that the native population of North Africans thought they were Black. So that fiction is done. The spreading by the sword fiction is done because the native language of Egypt at that time was not Mayat, 48 laws, the 38 confessions, none of that. It was Coptic Christianity. The Coptic Christians were under oppression of the Byzantine Empire. There were different types of Christians. So they were under oppression. And just like the native inhabitants of Spain welcomed the Muslims when they came and vanquished the Visigoths, because the Visigoths were ruling over them unjustly, and they were willing to take chances on a Muslim rule being more just, which it ended up being. The same exact way, the same thing happened in North Africa. The Coptic Christians took a chance that life would be better under Muslim rule than it was under the rule of their own fellow Christians from the Byzantine Empire. In fact, if you read the history, the Copts and the native North Africans assisted the Muslims, helped the Muslims when they came and invaded Egypt. The whole entire mystery schools of Egypt, Ma'at, Kemet, all that had already been done with 1,000 years before the Muslims showed up. So they didn't destroy Wakanda. They didn't destroy, some black Egyptian empire with pharaohs. That's fiction. The people of the area were non-sub-Saharan black. And the Arab armies were littered with dark-skinned people. Even people that, if we saw them today, we would consider them black. But let's take a look at Chancellor Williams. I'm gonna go to page 75 from Chancellor Williams' book. Because we need this. Now we're gonna move on. Now that we see that North Africa, the Hotep narrative on North Africa is wrong. What about other kingdoms? What about other black? Okay, maybe Egypt. Okay, Egypt was being ruled by white European Romans and Persians. Okay, but what about south of them, in maybe Nubia? What about the Nubian kingdom, the great Nubian kingdom, Nubian queens and Nubian kings? Certainly they were black, and these Arabs, white Arabs, okay, maybe there's some black Arabs, but they were sellouts. The white Arab armies, they destroyed their civilization, and they forced them to convert to Islam by the sword, because that's how people are. This is how people are. When people are married to a belief system, and it's based on lies, and it's based on emotionalism, and it's based on blind following. When you present facts to people like that, they only double down. Many of them, only a few people will recognize, have enough character and clear-mindedness to say, well, you know what? Maybe I need to rethink my position. Maybe I need to rethink it. Most people, what they're going to do is double down. How dare you? How dare you question Chancellor Williams? How dare you question Dr. Ben? That's what some people are going to say. So let's deal with that. In Chancellor Williams' book, on page 148, he talks about black. Notice he doesn't say Makuria. I think that's the way you pronounce it, Makuria. He says black Makuria. So he wants to make sure his reader, it's not that there's this Nubian kingdom called Makuria, it's black Makuria. So that sets up things inside your mind. Black versus white. And we're going to see that Chancellor Williams' book is littered with modern concepts from America that he reads back into history this is not scholarship, and it's not accurate. So, between 700 and 1200 AD, Makuria was more empire than kingdom. It was organized into 13 major states with a sub-king over each, the king of kings over all. The traditional African council was the final authority, no matter how powerful the king might seem to be. The great and colorful Pouwels, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, Pouwels of the king of kings had to be wider than those of the divisional kings, and theirs was larger than any lesser officials. Cyriacus was king of kings. Notice that name, Cyriacus. Is that an African name? It sounds Latin, Greek. In 745, when Omar, the governor of Egypt, stepped up the persecution of Christians in Egypt, what amounted to a Muslim holy war. Now, he makes this claim, right? He makes this claim. Destroying churches or converting them into mosques, and even putting the patriarch in prison. Since the patriarch in Egypt was the head of all Christian churches in Africa, the Africans regarded this latest onslaught against the church as an insult, as well as a breach of the peace treaty, now almost 100 years old. Strangely, the Muslims made Lower Egypt the area of greatest church destruction. Now, he's made a whole lot of claims. Have you noticed that there's not one citation yet? In fact, look at these 2 pages. Look at the bottom. No citations. No citations. And in fact, if you look through this whole entire book, you won't find any citations. So, Chancellor Williams was a scholar. Chancellor Williams was educated. He definitely was educated. We're not taking that away from him. But this book he made, Destruction of the Black Civilization, is not scholarly. It is not scholarly. It's a storybook. It's a storybook that may or may not contain factual information. In fact, I would go and say that it does contain some factual information. Yeah, there was a kingdom called Makuria. Yeah, there was a governor called Omar in Egypt. Yes, these were real people. But this narrative that he's putting together, he brings forth no evidence that can be examined and confirmed to prove what he's claiming. And in fact, we'll see that many of the notions that he's making are contradicted by documentation. The Africans regarded this latest onslaught against the churches as an insult, as well as a breach of the peace treaty, now almost 100 years old. Strangely, the Muslims made Lower Egypt the area of greatest church destruction. Based on what? When the arrogant Omar ignored all protests and pleas, the African kings headed an army of 100,000 men and marched on the Arab center of power in Lower Egypt. The governor of Egypt quickly freed the patriarch and promised to leave the Christians and their churches alone. Cyriacus accepted these assurances and withdrew his army from Egypt. It was during this period that an extensive body of church literature developed in African language, and remarkable pottery industries were expanded. Paintings, like writings, was stimulated by the church, so he's big up in the church. I mean, that's another thing I found interesting about this book. And he has a lot of criticism for Islam for the most part. He does compliment Islam in a couple of parts, but he has a lot of criticism for Islam. But it was very strange about this book that he big up and gave props to Christianity. I found that strange, especially him being African American, him understanding and knowing that his African ancestors, his great grandfather was a slave. If you look at his biography, he was enslaved by Christians. You know, the people who piloted those boats across the Atlantic were Christians. The people at the slave auction were Christians. People who purchased our ancestors were Christians. They served and worked under Christian overseers. But he has no smoke for Christianity. Right? I noticed this. And then the Black consciousness community and Hoteps and everybody who take his book as absolute gospel, if this is divine revelation, because I don't know what it's not a scholarly book. It doesn't have any citations. It doesn't quote anyone. It doesn't show any. any type of research. Where did his research come from? How did he perform his research? What was the methodology of his research? It doesn't say. So it's like the Bible. It should be taken on front face value. It's revelation about history. The people who take it that way and repeat the things that he says, none of them are critical enough. They just take his criticism of Islam. But I haven't heard anyone critical enough to ask, well, hold on. Why does he say such glowing things about the Christian church? Why does he criticize Christianity in the same way that he criticizes Islam? All right. I'm just looking at to see if there's anything. All right, now we got that. Let's look at something else. I want to show something about William Chancellor. This is William Chancellor's Wikipedia page. William Chancellor was born in 1893. He died in 1992. He was an American sociologist, historian, and writer. And obviously his most notable book about African civilization prior to the Europeans, his work, The Destruction of the Black Civilization, 1971-1974, remains a key feature of Afrocentric discourse. Goes about his history. He worked with the Crisis newspaper and the NAACP. Now look at this. Where did Chancellor Williams get his education? After working for a while, Williams entered college at Howard University, a historical black college. He earned an undergraduate degree in education in 1930, followed by a master's degree in history in 1935. After completing a doctoral dissertation on the socio-economic significance of the storefront church movement in the United States since 1920, he was awarded a PhD in sociology by the American University in 1949. International studies. Williams began his studies abroad in England as a visiting professor to the universities of Oxford and London in 1953 and 1954. In 1956, he did field research in African history at Ghana's University College. At that time, his focus was on African achievements and the many self-ruling civilizations that had arisen and operated on the continent long before the coming Europeans or East Asians. His last study, completed in 1964, covered 26 countries and more than 100 language groupings. It's not, I don't know if it says in here, but the brother talks about it in this book, that when Chancellor Williams was in Sudan, the country of Sudan, he actually was kicked out. He was kicked out of Sudan. And there's not a whole lot of information known about why he was kicked out. One of the theories is that the government took him to be a spy. Why did the government take him to be a spy? Because he was coming from these European universities, like the University of Oxford in London, and he was a staunch Christian. That's something a lot of people don't know. He was educated. He received his early education in black historical universities, yes. But his later education that led to him exploring the subject of black civilizations and gave him the opportunity to do the research for his book was with European English universities like Oxford. And when he went into Africa, he was kicked out of an African country because the Africans, according to one theory, believed him to be up to no good, to be an agent of some sort. I'm just putting the facts out there. You draw your conclusion. Now, he went on with his career. He worked at different schools. He was a teacher. And then he finally wrote the book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. He received many rewards for that. And then he died in 1992 at the age of 98. He lived a very long life. Now, let's look at this. This is from Black Dawah Network. Correcting Chancellor Williams, the destruction of black civilizations on Islam. I have this part highlighted because it's extremely important. Let's read. What if Chancellor Williams' book, Destruction of Black Civilization, was updated in 2019? What if the book was updated based on current research about the rise and fall of several African civilizations? The updated version would tackle several conflicting statements regarding the legacy of Islam in West Africa. Chancellor Williams speaks laudatory about Islam, stating that the Renaissance in Africa occurred at the same time it developed in Europe between the 15th and 16th century, and that both in Europe and Africa, Islamic sources were the catalyst. So this is actually in his book. Chancellor Williams admitted that there was a Renaissance that took place in Africa, in West Africa, and in Europe, and the catalyst for both Renaissances in the 15th and 16th century was Islamic. Right? So continuing to read. Here, Williams credits Islam for bringing about a revival of civilizations and culture throughout West Africa. Yet, in another portion of the book, Williams chronicles the downfall of the Ghanaian civilization of West Africa, stating that the destruction of the capital of Ghana by Muslims in 1076. Stop. Ghana was a Muslim empire. Ghana was a Muslim empire. It was ruled by Muslims. So I find it odd, his wording, that he says the destruction of the capital of Ghana by Muslims. Well, they were Muslims. So he's trying to, this is how you got to be careful when you are taking information from people. People sometimes give you half-truths, and a half-truth is a whole entire lie. So he's contrasting Ghana as being an African kingdom empire without telling the reader that it's an Islamic African empire, and that the Muslims came in 1076 and destroyed it. No, Ghana was Muslim itself. Continuing to read. With the Islamic invasion of Ghana, Chancellor Williams writes that the African masses, so he doesn't refer to them as Muslims or African Muslims, they're just simply African. African masses of the chorus were regarded as infidels, upon whom Muslims sought out to carry out forced conversions to Islam. Chancellor Williams' account of the fall of Ghana by Islamic invaders has created much animus towards Islam within the Black consciousness community, and is solidified their belief of Islam being a tool of subjugation over Black people. Moreover, it is hard to reconcile Williams' claim that Islam brought about an intellectual renaissance in West Africa, whilst simultaneously contributing to the destruction of an important civilization in West Africa. Yes, that's a contradiction. Let's be critical. How can in one side of your mouth say that Africa experienced a renaissance that was comparable to the renaissance that was happening in Europe? And we all know about the renaissance in Europe, but many of us don't know about the renaissance in Africa. It's comparable, and it's happening at the same time. And you give credit that Islam is the catalyst that brought about the renaissance in both Europe and Africa. So Africa is encountering a renaissance because of Islam, but yet at the same time, in the same exact book, you're claiming that Islam destroyed Ghana. Well, which one is it? Because two opposites can't be true at the same time. How can Islam bring about a renaissance in Ghana and also destroy Ghana at the same time? That doesn't make sense. Williams wrote his book in 1973, and at that time, the account of the collapse of the Ghana civilization by Muslim invaders was widely accepted theory in academia. Let me highlight that. Man, I wish there was a way I can I enlarge this? Can I zoom in? Can I zoom in? Yeah. Let's zoom in a little bit more. I want you to read that for yourself. Williams wrote in this book in 1973, and that time, Williams wrote this book in 1973, and that time, the account of the collapse of Ghanan civilization by Muslim invaders was widely accepted theory in academia. But it wasn't accurate. It's what academia believed at that time in 73, right? Where would Chancellor Williams have learned that? Where would Chancellor Williams have learned what Eurocentric academia believed about the fall of Ghana, the Empire of Ghana, being invaded by hordes of, wild-eyed Arab Muslims who destroyed that empire? Where did he learn that from? Where did he learn that from? Going back to the Wikipedia article, he would have learned that at Oxford and London in 1953 and 1954. That's where he would have learned that. So one of the key points concerning the history of Islam in his book, he got that position from his white professors at the University of Oxford in London. So when Afrocentrists and Black consciousness community people in Hoteps repeat this idea from his book, and they cite the Empire of Ghana being invaded by Muslims and destroyed because Chancellor Williams said it, Chancellor Williams did not independently come up with that concept. He learned that concept in his history courses and training from the time of Howard University up to the time in the 50s when he studied at Oxford in London with Orientalists. I can't even say it. Orientalists. The study of the Orient. Let's go back. Williams wrote this book in 73, and at that time, the account of the collapse of Ghana civilization by Muslim invaders was widely accepted theory in academia. The updated version of his book would include the current research which started in 1982 discredits such theories as European colonial propaganda. You see it? This updated version of his book would include the current research, which starting in 1982 discredits such theory as European colonial propaganda. In the article, The Conquest That Never Was, Ghana and Al-Moravids, 1076, historian David C. Conrad and Humphrey J. Fisher determined local oral tradition posited that drought was the major contributor to the collapse of Ghana. Through their analysis of oral archaeological and written records, could find no evidence at all that Muslim invaders destroyed Ghana. I've heard this so many times. And people get this from William Chancellor's book about how the great empire of Ghana was destroyed by these Arabs. Now, first of all, the Almoravids were Arabs. There's so many. Let's correct all the inaccuracies in what Chancellor Williams proposed to his people and to black people and to his audience. He claimed that Almoravids invaded and destroyed Ghana. Why? Because that's what Eurocentric academia was teaching and had taught him in his history classes. Modern research, as of 1982, discredited that as theory, discredited this theory as, look at that, European colonial propaganda. If you don't believe me, I've read this article right here. The Conquest That Never Was, Ghana and the Almoravids, 1076, historians David C. Conrad and Humphrey J. Fisher. You can look this up on the internet. You probably won't be able to get it for free. You might have to pay for it, but it's on the internet. In fact, let's Google it. This is Google. Ghana and the Almoravids, 1076. The local oral sources. This is an academic website that hosts academic articles. Now, Chancellor Williams' book would be featured on a website like this. Why? Because Chancellor Williams' book would not have been considered to be academic. He has no sources. He cites no one. He just makes claims. The Conquest That Never Was, Ghana and the Almoravids, 1076, the external Arabic sources. History of Africa. This was published in 1982. The Conquest That Never Was. We first conceived of this study several years ago when our respective lines of research seemed to some extent to converge on the period of the decline of ancient Ghana. It has proved a more complex matter than we imagined, or than the deceptively simple title above might suggest, partially because it is often more difficult to prove that something did not happen than that it did. We have to divide our analysis into two parts. First, we examine the external written sources from the Almoravid conquest of Ghana. Our work in this respect has been immensely facilitated by the appearance in 1975 of this looks like French. I'm not even going to attempt to reconcilier des sources arabes, which in some sense provides the infrastructure for our argument. We have also had the invaluable privilege of seeing in proof Hopkins and Levtzion's corpus of the early Arabic sources. In the second half of our study, it will be the turn of eternal sources, mainly oral traditions. We use the term external and internal advisedly, since the simple distinction between written sources and oral traditions is too artificial. An oral tradition was an oral tradition, whether written down in Arabic in the Middle Ages or in French in this century. And a great deal of the information in both parts of our article must have started as oral tradition. Putting it more bluntly, we have discovered no sources, whether external or internal, which ambiguously point to such a conquest. A handful of sources suggest some link between the rise of the Almoravids and the decline of Ghana, but with a puzzling vagueness, which decreases as the number of centuries between the alleged event and the report of it increases. All this material is discussed in part of the paper in one to follow. So these these historians, they poured over the evidence that was written in the Arabic language, and they poured over accounts of the griots, the oral tradition in West Africa, looking for evidence of this invasion that destroyed Ghana, and they found nothing, except maybe a vague connection between the rise of the Almoravid Empire and the decline of Ghana. So let's go back. The person who writes this article, that the researchers determined local oral tradition puts the onus on drought. It was the major contributor to the collapse of Ghana. So, why don't Afrocentrists, Black consciousness, and Hoteps know about that? Why don't they know about that? Yet in 2023, you still have people making Islamophobic comments to Muslims and about Muslims and about Islam, calling it an Arab religion, calling it an invader religion, and there's quoting a book from 1973 that has been discredited by actual real research. In a follow-up work, the Almoravid conquest of Ghana and the modern historiographical of Western Africa, Pika Masonin and Humphrey J. Fisher concluded that there is no direct evidence of any conquest, less still a violent and destructive of Ghana. No conquest, nothing violent, nothing destructive. They declared the narrative of an Islamic conquest of highlight that one. They declared the narrative of an Islamic conquest of Ghana to be a myth and a total historical fabrication. Tracing the origin of this theory behind the collapse of Ghana, they write, the conquest hypothesis is a European creation. Man, I need a clue bomb. Hold on. No. I need a clue bomb. I need to do that again. I need a clue bomb. So deliver me a clue bomb. Okay, let's read that again. This is the follow-up work. J. Humphrey Fisher, he was a part of the first paper. Now he does a follow-up paper with Pika Masonin. They declare, based on evidence, not emotions and feelings, not divining, not revelation, none of that. There is no direct evidence of a conquest, still less a violent and destructive of Ghana. They declared the narrative of an Islamic conquest of Ghana to be a myth and a total historical fabrication. Tracing the origins of this theory behind the collapse of Ghana, they write, the conquest hypothesis is of European creation. The conquest and destruction of Ghana by cruel Almoravids could have been seen as a historical example of a naive impact of Islamic fanaticism, justifying European protection in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, the narrative of Muslim invaders destroying Ghana and seeking to carry out forced conversions was a European-invented myth that gained acceptance in academia at the time of Williams' writings, but has since been discredited. Man, give me my clue bomb. Now the internet wants to mess up as soon as I want my clue bomb. Do I gotta read that a third time? They declared the narrative of an Islamic conquest of Ghana to be a myth, a total historical fabrication. So when you see Hoteps, when you see Brother Polite, when you see Dr. Umar Johnson, you see, and I just recently seen a video from Red Pill and Blue Pill, where they were talking about, they're not so critical of Islam as others, but they still made some historical inaccuracies talking about the Islam being spread with the sword through Africa. And they all say this based on Chancellor Williams' work, and Dr. Ben repeating Chancellor Williams' work. And it's all based on inaccurate information. Yes, Chancellor Williams may have not understood or known that, because he was just repeating what he had learned at Oxford's, and probably at the Black Historical University he attended as well. Because Western education is Eurocentric in nature. And it don't matter if it's a Black historical university either. It's still modeled after the European educational system. Hold one moment. Peace be upon those who separate God, and I'm back. So we see here Chancellor Williams' book contains historical inaccuracies. It contains Eurocentric, Islamophobic tropes. I would add it includes tropes against Africans as well. Right? Because the whole idea that, the whole idea of giving credit to African Islamic civilization in West Africa and East Africa to Arabs or someone else external to Africa it's based on the idea of the African not being qualified to have done something like that by himself. The African couldn't have been qualified to create his own empire or his own his civilization, Islamic or otherwise. So the credit has to go to someone else. And that was the mindset of those European academics when they saw the African empires in Africa, like the Ghanaian Empire, Songhai, Mali. It went against the whole Western civilization's notions of white supremacy. So they couldn't give credit to Africans, sub-Saharan Africans. So it had to have been Arabs from North Africa who came down and invaded and forced them into Islam and forced them into civilization. Because in their eyes, the African is so low, the African can never have his own civilization. He can never raise up his own civilization on his own. Either whites or Arabs had to come and civilize him. So in that sense, Chancellor Williams and other Afrocentrists are spreading anti-Black propaganda amongst Black people in the name of uplifting Black people and countering Eurocentricity. Do you see the problem? Do you see the problem? So going on, if published in the contemporary era, Williams' account of the destruction of civilization would not include the narrative of an Islamic destruction of Ghana that has been at the source of so much of the Black conscious community's animus towards Islam. Instead, he would focus more on his more historically collaborated claim that Islamic sources were the catalyst for the Renaissance in Africa. Yet members of the Black conscious community who continue to promulgate the narrative of an Islamic destruction of Ghanaian civilization should know they were repeating a myth designed to justify European colonialism and is as more fictional as the story of a white Egypt, whites building the Great Wall of Zimbabwe, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, take your pick. I still didn't get my clue bomb. Next live, I'm going to have clue bombs. I'm going to have and horns because we need it to emphasize what's going on here. Now, let's go back to Chancellor Williams' book, because now we've refuted 3 claims of his and other Afrocentrists. 1, we destroyed this claim that so-called white Arabs invaded a black Egypt and stole its legacy and converted people to Islam and had sex with the women and turned the population white. That's fiction. It's ahistorical. It didn't happen. Number 2, we've destroyed this notion that West African empires were invaded by Muslims from the north, Almoravids and others, that they were invaded and they were Arabized and Islamophied, and they're these great indigenous European African empires like Ghana were destroyed and replaced with Islam. And we have established out of the mouth of Williams himself that Islam entering into Africa was the catalyst for an African Renaissance that rivaled the Renaissance that was taking place at the same exact time in Europe. But what about what we read earlier about the Black Makuria, the Nubian, these Christian Nubians? We read that Cyracus, the king of this guy with a black guy with a Latin name, a Christian, he had to fight with Omar, the governor of Egypt. That Omar, the governor of Egypt, was waging a jihad, on the Christian Africans and spreading Islam by the sword and all this other stuff. Now, Chancellor Williams is struck out twice already. How much do you want to bet that this account that he gives also is the product of his Eurocentric education? How much you want to bet? First of all, let's talk about these Nubians. This is a Wikipedia article on the Nubians. Nubians, as a group of people, have been in the Horn of Africa, in the Nile Valley region, going way back as the 7,000 BC. An old people group. At some points in history, it was a part of Egypt. At other points in history, it was a separate area, even at odds with Egypt. Now, let's read this. Chancellor Williams told us about this black Nubia. And when you think of a black Nubia, certain visions may pop into your head, right? I know an idea, like maybe this guy here, this guy right here, these guys right here. You think of the Nilalic people, very tall, very, very dark-skinned people, right? That's what you think about when you think of a Nubian, but that's not necessarily what a Nubian looks like. So this is Google photo, right? You got like a black pharaoh right here next to pyramids. This is the same picture that's in that that Wikipedia article we just read about Nubia. That's what you think of when you think of a Nubian, right? But do you think about this? This guy right here, he's Nubian. He's Nubian. What about this lady with hijab on? She's Nubian. Obviously has the little girl in her hands. All right. Look at this. These people. Nubian. Nubians. These are also Nubian. This guy's very dark skinned. He's Nubian. With a thobe on. The guy next to him, he's like my color. Brown. But these guys are very dark. This guy is brown. This guy is brown. Well, see, the Afrocentrist is going to say, well, see, brother, they were, a dark chocolate, original man. And then those Arabs, them white Arabs, came in and mixed with the people. That's how they got light skin like that. Really? Really? Now, this is an ancient Egyptian painting. Notice something. This one is supposed to be a Libyan, a North African. Very light-skinned. Which tells you what North Africans look like. Then you got a Nubian. He's dark-skinned. He's very dark-skinned. An Asiatic man. An Egyptian. He's kind of like in the middle. He's like my color. But let's look at this. Going back to the Wikipedia article on Nubians. Listen to what it says. Let me make this. Let me blow this up so you can see it. A 4th century victory Satella, that's what a Satella is, commemorative of Etamite King Izania. Etamite kingdom was Horn of African kingdom, present day, Ethiopia, Eritrea. Contains inscriptions describing 2 distinct population groups dwelling in ancient Nubia. A red population and a black population. This is the 4th century. So, this is before Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born. This is 2 centuries before he was born. 2 centuries before the Quran came down. 2 centuries before you can even make a claim that hordes of white Arabs came and invaded Africa. 2 centuries before Chancellor Williams' chapter about Black Makuria. And the narrative is made by a fellow African, the king of the Etamite kingdom, another African. He describes the population of ancient Nubia as 2 different groups of people, or 2 different colors, a red people and a black people. That's the source. Right there. I wonder if there's a way I can find that source so you can read directly from it. Okay. So, yes, there were very dark-skinned, very beautiful dark-skinned Nubians. But once again, the Afrocentric Black consciousness community has hoisted ahistorical fiction upon the Black community when they make us believe that Nubians are all very dark, black-skinned people, smooth skin, and that when we see light-skinned Nubians, oh, those are Arabs. Oh, they're mixed with Arab. Oh, the Arabs came and invaded and conquered them and mixed with them. That's why they're like that. No, before Islam, Africans described Nubians as being of a red population and a black population, just like the pictures we're seeing. Going back to the pictures, look at that. Look at that lady. Look at her skin tone. Look at these people. Look at her. Look at her skin tone. Look at the baby skin tone. This is not due to. This is not. And I'm sure there's some admixture, because people mix with each other. That's what people do. And when people mix with each other, it's not always an issue of one group of people dominating another group of people. It's not an issue. The problem with Afrocentrists is that they're so focused on modern day white supremacy and countering it that they make the mistake of they see white supremacy everywhere, even where it's not. So white supremacy doesn't exist in the 4th century AD. It doesn't exist when Muslim armies are coming into Africa and North Africa. It doesn't exist. But the Afrocentrist, he sees it and he wants to read it into history, and he uses his presuppositions, his assumptions, to reinterpret history into Afrocentricity and present it to the public. This young man and that young lady, people, this skin color were indigenous to Nubia before Islam. Right? So that's now we got a third claim of William Chancellor's book debunked. Right? What else? What else can we debunk? Now, this is the Wikipedia article on Korea. Now, there was something in here that I wanted to touch on. So this is talking about in the early 4th century, if not before, the kingdom of Kush, with its capital, Meroe, was collapsing. Right? Well, look at that. African kingdoms collapsed, not in history. It had nothing to do, and this one had nothing to do with Islam or Arabs. This is before that. Because that's the nature of governments. Kingdoms rise up, they hit a zenith, and then they decline, and then they're lost to history. That happens. It's not always because of white supremacy. It is not always because, somebody else caused it to happen. Wakanda is not real. Wakanda is not real. There's no fictitious 1,000-year empire of super technological Superman black people. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital Meroe, was collapsing. The region which would later constitute Korea, i.e. the Nile Valley between the 3rd Nile Cataract and the Great Nile Bend of the 4th and 5th Cataract, has been proposed to have seceded from Kush already in the 3rd century. Here, a homogeneous and relatively isolated culture dubbed the Pre-Korea developed. During the 4th and 5th centuries, the region of Napata, located near the 4th Cataract and formerly being one of the most important political and sacred places of Kush, served as the center for a new regional elite buried in large tumuli like those of El-Zuma and Tankasi. There was a significant population growth accomplished by social transformations, resulting in the absorption of the Kushites into the Nubians. So the Nubians overpower the Kushites. It's not white people overpowering black people. This is black people, one group of black people in Africa, absorbing another group of black people in Africa. That happens. That happens. A people originally from Cordova. Who's going to say that? What is Cordova? Cordova is in Central Sudan, present day. These people migrated from Central Sudan, came to that area, and took over. Isn't that, I mean, if I wanted to push a narrative, I could not push a narrative like these people invaded. They invaded this area of the Nile Valley, the Kush Kingdom, and took it over, right? Maybe I can even be even more ahistorical. I could claim they had white skin, right? That had settled in the Nile Valley in the 4th century. Thus, the new Makorian society and state emerged by the 5th century. So they emerged by the 5th century. Everything that Chancellor Williams is talking about is not too long after that. It's not too long after that. The Makoria have not existed that long when this scenario he claims starts happening. In the 5th century, one of the first Makorian kings moved the power base of the still developing kingdom from Napata to further downstream, where the fortress of Dongola, the new seat of royal court, was founded, in which soon developed a vast urban district. Many more fortresses were built along the banks of the Nile, probably not intended to serve a military purpose, but to foster urbanization. Already at the time of the foundation of Dongola, contacts were maintained with the Byzantine Empire. I want to focus on that. Let me make that even bigger. So, Makuria had already made contacts and maintained them with the Byzantine Empire. Remember, I mentioned the Byzantine Empire earlier. They were one of the 2 superpowers during the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The other being the Persians. And then the Muslims, under Abu Bakr, may Allah have mercy upon him, they come in direct military contact with both the Byzantine and the Persian empires. Right? And who's their ally? The Muslims are fighting the Byzantines. The Byzantines are not black. The Byzantines are Europeans. And who's aligned with the Byzantines? Who? The Makuria. In the 530s, this Byzantines under Emperor Justinian mounted a policy of expansion. The Nubians were part of this plan to win allies against the Sasanian Persians by converting them to Christianity. Chancellor Williams, like Afrocentrists tend to do, they make this ahistorical romanticization of African history. So you got the Black Makuria, it's Wakanda. They're just sitting there minding their own business, not hurting nobody else. Then all of a sudden, these mean, angry Arabs from Egypt come down and try to conquer them, and say they're trying to force them to convert to Islam and convert their churches. They're so mean. It's a narrative that paints. It's not Afrocentric at all, because it's constantly painting African people as victims. It feeds into victimization and the victimhood mentality. And that's ahistorical. The Makuria people were not victims. It was a kingdom. They participated in intrigue, warfare. They were playing chess just like the other kingdoms and empires. They had alignments with the superpower of the day, the Byzantines. They were working with the Byzantines to do what? Working against the Persians, against their influence. How were they doing that? To help the Byzantines expand their empire. How? By trying to convert people to Christianity. They were doing the exact same thing that Chancellor Williams accuses the Muslims of Egypt of doing. But somehow the Muslims of Egypt are bad, evil, warmongering people spreading Islam by the sword. But the Makoria, it's just Wakanda. They're just minding their own business. They're good people. In the 530s, the Byzantine emperor under Justinian mounted a policy of expansion. The Nubians were part of this plan to win allies against the Sasanian Persians by converting them to Christianity, the Byzantine state religion. The imperial court, however, was divided into two sects, believing in two different natures of Jesus Christ. Justinian belonged to the Chalcedonians, the official denomination of the empire, while his wife Theodora was a Miaphite, who were the strongest in Egypt. Who were the strongest where? In Egypt. So the Miaphites were strong where? In Egypt. They were Christians. So Christians existed in Egypt. But according to Chancellor Williams, the being nasty Arabs in Egypt are coming down to Nubia to try to force the Christians to convert to Islam. Well, why wouldn't they force the Muslims? Why wouldn't they force the Christians where they were at into Islam? Why would they leave where they're at to come down to South Egypt and Nubia to force them and convert their churches to mosques, but leave the Christians that live next door to them alone? How does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't make sense at all. Hold on, let me find the article again. I lost my place. Okay, here we go. John Ephesus described how two competing missions were sent to Nubia, with the Miaphite arriving first in and converting the northern kingdom of Nabatea in 543, while the Nabatean king refused Justinian's mission to travel further south. Hold on, let me stop. He refused for Justinian's missionaries to travel further south. Where did they come from? They're coming from Egypt. Actually, I need to take that back. I made a mistake. So, this is in 543. Actually, there are no Muslims in Egypt. So forget what I just said a couple of minutes ago. There are no Muslims in Egypt at this time. But Egypt is being ruled by who? Black Wakanda, right? No. European Christians. Being ruled by European Christians. And who's their ally? The Black Makoria, as Chancellor Williams puts it. While the Nabatean king refused Justinian's mission to travel further south, archaeological records might suggest that the Makoria converted still in the first half of the 6th century. The chronicler John of Biclair recorded that in around 568, Makoria had received the faith of Christ. In 573, a Makorian delegation arrived in Constantinople, offering ivory and a draft and declaring its good relations with the Byzantines. So who are the Makoria allies with? The Byzantines. Unlike Nabatea in the north, which Makoria seem to have been in enmity, the Alodia in the south, Makoria embraced the Chalcedonian doctrine. The early ecclesiastical architecture at Dongola confirms the close relations maintained with the empire. Trade between the two states was flourishing. In the 7th century, Makoria and its northern neighbor, Nabatea. Oh. So Makoria, Christians, aligned with Constantinople, and they're following their brand of Christianity. They're at odds with another Black African kingdom to the north of them, who are Christian also, but they're a different type of Christian. I love how they say this, annexed its northern kingdom. In other words, they conquered them. Who conquered them? Black people. So you have one Black empire being conquered by another Black empire. You can't blame this on Arabs coming in with curved swords. You can't blame it on the white man. You can't blame Black people conquered another group of Black people. While there are several contradicting theories, it seems likely that this occurred soon after the Sasanian occupation of Egypt, presumably during the 620s, but before 642. Before the Sasanian invasion, Nabatea used to have strong ties with Egypt and was thus hit hard by its fall. Perhaps it was also invaded by the Sasanians itself. Some local churches from that period show traces of destruction and subsequent rebranding. Oh, so the Persians came in and destroyed Black churches, Black Nubian churches, and rebranded them. But Chancellor Williams doesn't have any smoke for the Persians. No. Thus, weakened Nabatea fell to Makoria, making Makoria extend as far north as Philae, near the first cataract. A new bishopric was founded in Faras in around 630, and two new cathedrals styled after the basilica in Dongola were built in Faras and Kaiser Ibrahim. It is not known what happened to the royal Nabatean family after the unification, but it is recorded that Nabatea remained a separate entity under the United Kingdom governed by the Ifaric. Between 639 and 641, the Muslim Arabs overran who? Wakanda? No. They overran Byzantine Egypt. They overran the Black Pharaohs with Ankhs? No. The Byzantine Arabs. Go back. A Byzantine request for help remained unanswered by the Nubians due to conflicts with the Bija. Oh. So, the Nubians are at, before this happens, the Nubians are allies with Byzantine, right? They're boys. They clicked up. Byzantine gets invaded by the Muslims. And if you go back to the beginning of this program, I told you why that happened. It didn't happen because, angry, violent Arabs with curved swords wanted to convert them to Islam. No, the Byzantines were incurring into Arabia and into the affairs of the Muslims, into the affairs of Abu Bakr. May Allah have mercy upon him. The northern Arabian tribes tried to rebel against Abu Bakr, may Allah have mercy upon him, under the influence of the Byzantines. So Abu Bakr sent Muslim soldiers to the north, and that conflict spilled out of Arabia all the way into North Africa, and Byzantine fell. Now, Byzantine requested help from their Nubian friends, their Nubian Christian friends, and it was ignored. In 641 or 642, the Arabs sent a first expedition to Makoria. While it is not clear how far south it penetrated, it was eventually defeated. A second invasion led by Abdullah ibn Sar followed in 652. When the attackers pushed as far south as Dongola, Dongola was besieged and bombarded by catapults. While they damaged parts of the town, they could not penetrate the walls of the citadel. Muslim sources highlighted the skill of the Nubian archers in repelling the invasion. With both sides being unable to decide the battle in their favor, Abi Hartsarsh and the Makurian king, excuse me, Kwali Durat, and that's a heck of a name, eventually meet and draw up a treaty known as the Bout. I think that's how you pronounce that. The Bout was a 7th century CE treaty between the Christian state of Makuria and the new Muslim rulers of Egypt, lasting almost 700 years. It is by some measures the longest lasting treaty in history. That contradicts what Chancellor Williams said. Let's go back to Chancellor Williams' book. He claims in 745. Again, he claims in 745 that Umar, the governor of Egypt, stepped up the persecution of Christians in Egypt in what amounted to a Muslim holy war, destroying churches and converting them into mosques, even putting the patriarch in prison. Since the patriarch in Egypt was the head of all Christian churches in Africa, the Africans regarded this latest onslaught against the churches as an insult, as well as a breach of the peace treaty, now almost 100 years old. So he's claiming the peace treaty is broken by the Muslims 100 years after it's ratified. But this peace treaty is hailed as the longest lasting peace treaty in history. 700 years. So which one is it? Which one is it? It can't be both. It can't be both. Here are some of the provisions of that treaty. There are no extant copy of the treaty that they signed, and the earliest copies are several centuries after the fact and quite varied. The treaty might not have been written at all. It may have just been an oral agreement. Some sections of the Pact are clear. The Arabs would not attack Nubia, and the Nubians would not attack Egypt. Well, according to what Chancellor Williams said, it sounds like it was the Nubians who broke the treaty. The citizens of the two nations would be allowed to freely trade and travel between the two states and would be guaranteed safe passage while in other nations. This doesn't sound like crazed Arab Muslims who wanted to convert people by the sword at all costs. Immigration to and settlement in the other nations' lands was forbidden. So you could travel and do trade, but you couldn't immigrate. Fugitives were to be extradited and were escaped slaves. The Nubians were responsible for maintaining a mosque for Muslim visitors and residents. They agreed to that. The Muslims had no obligation to protect the Nubians from attacks by third parties. The most important provision was that 360 slaves per year were to be sent to Egypt in exchange for cargoes of wheat and lentils. Hold on, wait a minute. These slaves had to be of the highest quality, meaning that the elderly and children were excluded. The slaves sent had to be of a mix of male and female. In some reports, an extra 40 were due, which were distributed among the notables in Egypt. So, let's put this together. Fugitives were to be extradited as well as escaped slaves. So, they both had slaves. The Muslim Egyptians had slaves, and the Nubians had slaves. And part of this deal, the Nubians were going to supply Egypt under Islamic rule with slaves. But hold on. The Afrocentric narrative tells me that it was these crazy sword-wielding, fanatical Muslim Arabs who came and invaded Africa and enslaved Africans and forced them into Islam. No, according to the historical record, they made a deal with Islamic. They made a deal with non-Islamic African empires, where African empires freely agreed to send their slaves into Islamic Egypt. Man, one claim after the other claim keeps falling and falling hard. It's almost, can we say, any of the negative things that Chancellor Williams says in his book about Muslims in Africa, is any of it historically accurate? It doesn't appear as if none of it is historically accurate. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. So there you have it. And, you know, Christians still exist to this day in Nubia. So that's another proof against this idea that the Muslims conquered and forced the Nubians into Christianity. None of that, none of this stuff is historically accurate. Boom, there it is. I might have to do another show on this. I just may have to, because I have so much information that I haven't even got to yet. I have articles, I have books, I haven't quoted yet about this subject. I might have to do a part 2. If you want me to do a part 2, hit the like button and share this video. Hit the like button, share the video, and make comments. Make comments. Thank you for taking the time, because I'm about to go pray now. It's time to pray. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, share. Subscribe, like, and share. If you don't like it, give it a thumbs down. Engagement is engagement. All engagement is good engagement when it comes to YouTube and Google. Thank you for taking the time. Hope you like the material and the content. And let the truth go forth and do not stop it. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon those who accept the guidance.